Jessica Lawson didn't think twice about leaving her house for a quiet week away. Her flight to Arizona had been booked months in advance, a rare break from the mounting tension of day-to-day responsibilities and the uneventful, if slightly strained, interactions with her neighbors. She had someone trustworthy watching the place. Max, her current tenant, a quiet and observant man in his mid-30s who worked as a police dispatcher for the city. He rented the main portion of the house, while Jessica had converted the upstairs into a small office and studio space she used only occasionally. It was a perfect arrangement. Max wasn't just reliable, he was meticulous. He paid rent early, kept the place cleaner than she ever expected from a bachelor, and knew how to handle himself in the face of unexpected problems, a skill she appreciated more than ever now that she was out of state. The house was modest but well built, an old craftsman-style structure nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. Most of the residents were older, long-timers who remembered when the neighborhood had fewer fences and more front porch conversations. But in recent years, a creeping possessiveness had taken root, and no one embodied that shift more than Karen. Karen lived 2 doors down. She was large, loud, and always seemed to be surveying the street as though conducting a daily audit. Her front yard was over-decorated with faux Victorian statues, seasonal flags, and laminated signs warning about dogs she didn't own. She had a habit of inserting herself into things that had nothing to do with her, asking about water usage, lawn care, trash schedules, and community standards that didn't exist in any real document. Jessica had clashed with her once before over the location of her compost bin, but since Max had moved in, Karen had gone quiet. Too quiet. Jessica had a faint feeling before she left that something might be off, but she brushed it away. Max was there, and Karen had no real reason to bother them again. Besides, she hadn't heard a peep from the woman in months. She left Max a list of minor things to look after. Bring in the mail, water the rosemary bush, reset the sprinklers if they glitched. Nothing major. She drove to the airport at sunrise, listening to classic rock and feeling like, for once, everything was stable. Of course, she had no idea that while she was watching the desert sun dip behind red mountains, someone back home was watching her house and making plans. Max noticed something was wrong the moment he stepped through the front door. The house was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. There was no hum from the refrigerator, no glow from the hallway light, and the digital clock on the microwave was blank. At first, he assumed it was just a minor outage. The neighborhood's infrastructure wasn't exactly modern, and it wasn't unusual for older properties to have occasional hiccups. He checked his phone, hoping to report the issue, but the battery was low. The charger near the couch had been acting up, and he'd meant to replace it. That detail, small and irritating, felt suddenly important. He turned on the flashlight and made his way to the breaker panel, only to find everything in place. No tripped switches, no blown fuses. Everything inside was functioning as it should. That's when he stepped outside and noticed the rest of the street was lit. Neighboring houses glowed with porch lights and window lamps. Security lights flickered faintly across driveways. Even the excessive floodlight in Karen's yard cast its usual harsh glare across the sidewalk. But Jessica's house stood in complete darkness, like a single piece of the street had been excised from the grid entirely. The discomfort sharpened into something more serious. Max followed the line of the fence to the side of the house, walking along the gravel with deliberate steps. When he reached the rear corner, he found the conduit box ajar. The metal latch had been forced, the cover tossed carelessly under a bush, and the line had been cut. Not frayed or torn, but cleanly severed. Someone had done it with precision. At the base of the panel, lying in the grass, was a pair of wire cutters, pink-handled, patterned with tiny floral shapes. They looked like something sold in a home goods aisle, not a toolbox. One of the grips was torn and the metal head slightly rusted. The message wasn't written, but it was clear. This was no accident. This was intentional. Max didn't call Karen. He didn't knock on her door or shout across the street. He returned inside, retrieved the emergency battery pack Jessica kept by the supplies cabinet, powered his phone, and filed a tampering report through the secure internal system used by city staff. It wasn't a complaint. It was a formal incident log coded for infrastructure interference. It triggered an alert, not just in utilities, but in public safety coordination. When technicians arrived, they didn't ask many questions. They went straight to work, inspecting the external connections. One of them crouched by the panel, then stood up with a flat expression and said, "Someone knew exactly what they were doing." They didn't speculate further. Max didn't offer theories. The second technician located the auxiliary junction buried under the sidewalk near the street. That one had been disturbed too. The panel was unlatched and the grounding wire bent back in a way that suggested intentional manipulation. Someone had targeted two separate points of access. It was more than a prank, more than a burst of anger. It was deliberate disconnection. As repairs were underway, Max observed the street. The neighborhood remained quiet. Windows closed, blinds drawn. Karen's house looked as it always did, overdecorated with that overbearing sense of watching without moving. He noticed the curtain shift once. A flicker, not enough to catch a face, but just enough to confirm what he already knew. He didn't react. Instead, he stood by while the technicians finished, took photographs, received the incident code, and added it to the case file. By the time the last tool was packed away, Max had the foundation of something bigger. He hadn't shouted or accused. He hadn't confronted anyone. But what happened that night wasn't going away. It was documented, verified, and officially registered. And whoever was behind it had now set in motion something they couldn't take back. Karen didn't say anything for the first 2 days. That in itself was unusual. She was the type of woman who thrived on the illusion of concern. Someone who weaponized friendliness like a blunt object. Always smiling too long, asking questions that weren't hers to ask, appearing in doorways just to remark on mailboxes, trash, bins, or the sound of someone's music barely playing through closed windows. So when she remained silent after what had happened, when she didn't even acknowledge Max or glance in his direction, despite knowing perfectly well what the technicians were there for, it wasn't just strange. It was strategic. She was laying low, waiting, assessing whether the move she'd made was going to bring consequences or quietly vanish like so many neighborhood grievances do. But she misjudged the atmosphere, and more importantly, she misjudged Max. While she sat behind her curtains, pretending not to watch, he followed protocol. The city's infrastructure department flagged the tampering as a critical incident, and because of his status as a dispatcher, Max's internal report had been fast-tracked. Jessica's name was on the deed, but the city viewed the residence as an active housing unit with law enforcement affiliation, which triggered a formal response, not just from utilities, but from municipal risk assessment. That meant a paper trail was already forming. It meant questions were already being asked in places Karen couldn't see. Max went about his week as if nothing had happened, maintaining a steady rhythm, making no direct moves, showing no change in behavior. That, too, was part of the response. The more normal he appeared, the more likely Karen was to relax, to believe that maybe it had worked. Maybe the pressure had caused enough discomfort that Jessica would return from her trip and rethink the lease. But Jessica wasn't easily spooked, and Max wasn't someone who flinched under tension. So while Karen resumed her morning rituals, watering her oversized lawn, adjusting her bird feeders, commenting loudly on neighborhood matters with her usual clique of porch sitters, Max quietly installed a new lock on the gate and repositioned the shim, side camera Jessica had mounted 6 months prior. It now captured a wider range, including the edge of Karen's fence. The escalation came in an indirect form. One afternoon, a city code compliance officer knocked on the door. Max answered, unsure what this visit was about. The man held a clipboard, wore a neutral expression, and explained there had been a complaint filed about improper waste storage and unpermitted alterations to the backyard. Max blinked once, then asked for clarification. The officer pointed to the side yard and mentioned a report claiming unsightly or hazardous conditions due to recent electrical work and debris. Max invited him to look for himself. The officer walked the path, saw the neatly sealed conduit panel, the clean gravel path, and a covered electrical box marked with the city's own tape from the technician crew. There was no violation, no debris, no hazard. The officer, slightly embarrassed, apologized for the intrusion and said it was likely just a routine response to a flagged form. But Max knew better. He knew how the complaint process worked, how certain residents used it not for safety but as a tool of pressure. He thanked the officer, let him leave, and made no comment. He didn't need to. The record of the inspection now existed, and so did the absence of any violation. The next morning, a small cardboard box appeared at the edge of the property just beside the sidewalk. It was sealed but slightly dented, like it had been kicked or dropped. There was no address, no label. Max picked it up carefully, checked its weight, and carried it inside. When he opened it, he found a pile of soaked newspapers. moldy scraps of something that might have been food at one point, and a single flyer from a local real estate firm with a red circle drawn over a photo of the house. Jessica's house, advertising. It as a potential restoration project with neighborhood history. There was no signature, but the intent was clear. It wasn't just trash. It was a message. A warning disguised as garbage. Max didn't report it. Not yet. Instead, he documented everything. Photographs, timestamps, packaging condition, and filed it under a private case log he maintained separately. As a dispatcher, he had learned to respect patterns more than incidents, and the pattern forming here was consistent. Indirect confrontation, denial of intent, and psychological pressure layered with plausible deniability. Karen wasn't attacking with noise or arguments. She was using the tools of neighborhood civility against them. Complaints, passive suggestions, and staged incidents that always fell just short of legal misconduct. Jessica returned the following evening, unaware of what had unfolded during her absence. Max updated her calmly without dramatics, showing her the reports, the technician photos, the code compliance notice, and the garbage box. She didn't panic. She asked pointed questions, took notes, and made one thing immediately clear. She wasn't going to be forced out of her own home by a woman with too much time and too little accountability. But she was smart enough to understand the difference between defiance and strategy. The next morning, they drove together to the city infrastructure office. Jessica requested a formal letter confirming the repair work, including the technician statements and utility assessment logs. She filed a notarized document establishing that the property had been tampered with externally and requested it be added to the neighborhood safety file under property interference. The clerk behind the counter was surprised by the thoroughness. Most people, when filing such claims, came in emotional or confused. Jessica was calm, direct, and had everything in order. When they left the office, Max said nothing. He didn't need to. Jessica had just shifted the tone of the situation, not from defense to offense, but from reaction to accountability. When they returned home, they noticed something else. The bird feeder in Karen's yard had been moved. It now faced directly toward their kitchen window, the swinging plastic tray hanging like a surveillance token. It was petty, obvious, almost childish. Jessica smiled when she saw it, a thin, quiet smile that wasn't friendly. Then she went inside, pulled out her phone, and made an appointment with a private property attorney. Not for a lawsuit, not yet, but for advisement on what documentation was needed should formal legal pressure become necessary. Karen had made the first move. The second had followed. But now the game was changing, and Jessica wasn't going to play it by Karen's rules. Jessica didn't believe in overreacting, but she had a deep respect for patterns. Patterns told stories. They revealed motives better than words ever could. After meeting with the property attorney, she began building a paper trail more thoroughly than the law technically required. She wasn't planning on taking anyone to court just yet, but she knew what it meant when people like Karen pushed boundaries. They weren't looking for an immediate win. They were looking for erosion, for the gradual breakdown of resistance through confusion, discomfort, and exhaustion. Jessica, however, had no intention of becoming part of someone else's quiet conquest. She started organizing all of the evidence Max had already gathered, incident numbers, inspection records, photographs, and cross-referenced them with her own documentation. Photos of the backyard before the tampering, receipts for electrical, maintenance, and past communications regarding property access. Nothing was done impulsively. Everything was time-stamped, notarized, or filed where it could be retrieved at a moment's notice. Karen, for her part, didn't change tactics so much as double down on the ones she thought worked. Over the course of the next week, several small disturbances took place. A row of solar lights Jessica had installed along the driveway were knocked over, seemingly by accident. Her trash bins were turned just slightly sideways every morning, enough that the waste collectors began skipping them under the assumption that they were misplaced. A potted rosemary plant on the porch was found broken one afternoon, tipped as if by a strong gust. Except there had been no wind that day. None of it was dramatic. All of it was just irritating enough to notice, but minor enough to be brushed off by someone who didn't understand the context. But Jessica did. Max did. And more importantly, now so did the attorney, who advised her to maintain her position, not escalate, and let the evidence build. She reminded Jessica of something crucial. In situations like this, the person pushing hardest often reveals more than they intend. The shift came when Jessica received a notice from the city's planning department. It stated that a neighbor had submitted a report claiming unauthorized modification to drainage lines running beneath the shared property boundary. According to the complaint, her yard's grading may have interfered with the natural water flow, potentially putting surrounding homes at risk of flooding. It was absurd. Her yard sloped inward, not outward. There was no drainage line. The supposed violation didn't even make structural sense. But the accusation was enough to trigger a municipal inspection. A city assessor arrived 2 days later and was surprised to find Jessica not only expecting him, but prepared with property blueprints, landscape permits, and an archived survey map from when the lot was originally divided decades ago. She walked him through the backyard, pointed to the retaining wall, the soil grade, the location of the drainage grate that sat entirely on her side. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't mention Karen. But she asked politely whether the assessor could clarify how the complaint was filed and what documentation had supported it. He glanced at his tablet, adjusted his posture, and admitted that the complaint had included no images, only a handwritten form and a vaguely marked sketch that didn't match any current layouts. That response told Jessica everything. It wasn't about the drainage. It was about manufacturing official interference, just enough to destabilize her daily life. But again, the attempt backfired. The assessor concluded the visit by stating that the property was well maintained and fully compliant. He even left a comment on file noting that the complaint lacked merit and contained inconsistencies. Later that evening, Jessica sat at the kitchen table reviewing the inspection summary while Max reheated leftovers. He'd been quiet during the day, not withdrawn but contemplative, watching the situation unfold with a practiced detachment that came from years of handling other people's emergencies. But this wasn't someone else's life now. It was theirs, and he'd begun to take notes of his own, details he picked up that Jessica might miss. Subtle changes in neighborhood noise, how long Karen's porch light stayed on, when her trash bins were rolled back inside. Max believed in patterns too, and what he was noticing now was a distinct increase in Karen's activity. She was moving more at night, stepping out into her yard during hours she never used to, rearranging things under the guise of tending to her lawn. Once, just past midnight, Max saw her dragging something heavy behind her fence. A black plastic bag that she dumped into the large bin, and then immediately covered with flattened cardboard. It wasn't suspicious enough to justify a call, but it wasn't normal either. It was during this time that Jessica received an unmarked envelope in the mailbox. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a single photograph. The paper contained no threats, no vulgarity, just a simple typed sentence. Ask the previous owners why they really moved. The photograph was an old image of the house taken from across the street. It was a candid shot, slightly tilted, dated in the corner in faded ink from almost 6 years ago. In the window, barely visible, was a different set of curtains, a different paint color. Someone had gone through the effort of tracking down a moment from years before and delivering it by hand, not through the post. Jessica studied the photo for a long time, trying to place the angle, the intent. It wasn't a warning. It was a breadcrumb. When she showed it to Max, he stared at it for a moment, then quietly said that he recognized the layout. Not from personal memory, but from a report he'd once seen, years ago, buried in an archive during a city data consolidation. The house had once been marked in a list of flagged properties, houses associated with repeated low-grade complaints, difficult neighbor relations, and recurring occupancy changes. Nothing criminal. Nothing that made headlines. But a pattern. Jessica folded the photo, slipped it back in the envelope, and placed it in a new folder marked Personal Do Not Shred. What she felt that night wasn't fear. It was confirmation. The pressure campaign wasn't a phase, and it wasn't random. Karen had done this before, possibly more than once. And now, with each escalation met with calm documentation and reinforced boundaries, Jessica understood the truth. She wasn't being pushed toward chaos. She was being tested for silence. But silence was no longer an option. The second escalation didn't come with noise or confrontation. It began instead with something oddly bureaucratic. A noise ordinance notice hand-delivered to Jessica's door, The paper was crisp, freshly printed, and affixed with the city's emblem, but its contents were both vague and oddly accusatory. It stated that multiple neighbors had filed reports citing excessive nighttime disturbances originating from her property, including mechanical humming, repetitive thudding, and bright intrusive lighting. Jessica read the document 3 times before setting it on the table, wondering if she'd somehow overlooked some malfunctioning device or timer. She and Max had installed a security lighting around the side gate, but the bulbs were motion-activated and shielded. As for any humming or thudding, there had been none, just the sound of a normal house lived in with quiet discipline. Max wasn't surprised when she showed him the paper. He didn't even look confused. He simply nodded once like a man who had been expecting it and opened a note app where he'd been logging events for the past 2 weeks. There, he showed her entries that matched the timeline of the supposed disturbances. One in particular stood out. A night Max had seen Karen wheeling a trash bin down the sidewalk well past midnight. It wasn't trash day. She hadn't placed it near the curb. She had simply wheeled it past Jessica's house and then back again, pausing near the edge of the lawn. There was no sound loud enough to be recorded, but Max had noted the movement anyway. That night, he'd also noticed her porch lights flicker on and off in a strange pattern, 3 times in quick succession. Now, looking at the fabricated complaint, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been some attempt to bait a reaction or simulate one. Jessica, already weary of playing by the silent rules of neighborhood civility, didn't waste time drafting a letter of rebuttal. Instead, she called the city department responsible for enforcement and requested a full report of the noise complaint, including timestamps, decibel logs, if any, and the names of the individuals who had submitted the forms. The woman on the line hesitated, then admitted that the system allowed anonymous complaints to be logged through a web portal, no verification required. Jessica asked if multiple reports had indeed been submitted, or if it had simply been one repeated submission. There was a pause. Then the voice said, almost quietly, that the entries appeared similar in language. Jessica thanked her and hung up, not angry, just more certain than ever that the harassment wasn't going to slow down on its own. The next blow came not through the city, but directly to the property. One morning, Max stepped outside and found a large container of raw meat dumped near the backyard gate. Uncooked, pink, and already attracting flies. It wasn't in packaging. It wasn't part of someone's trash. It had been placed there, deliberately. Alongside it, 2 of the security motion lights had been unscrewed. One had been left dangling by a single wire. Max called Jessica outside, and together they circled the property. There were no signs of forced entry. The gate hadn't been breached, but whoever did it had been close enough to the house to damage infrastructure and plant a rotting object with calculated intent. It wasn't a childish prank. It was intimidation. Jessica called animal control, not to clean the mess, that she could do herself, but to report the dumping as a potential biohazard. When the officer arrived, he was visibly disturbed by the quantity and proximity of the meat to the living quarters. He documented everything, took photographs, and filed a report classifying the incident as an unauthorized food-based environmental risk, a code designed not for homeowners, but to protect urban wildlife and domestic pets from possible contamination. As he left, he told Jessica quietly that this wasn't the first time he'd been called to the block for unusual materials showing up in yards. That night, Jessica updated her attorney, who advised immediate installation of higher-grade surveillance and formal notification to the city's neighborhood relations officer. A letter was drafted that included copies of all filed reports to date, along with photos of the latest incident, technician statements, and the printed complaint records. It was structured not as a legal threat, but as a comprehensive timeline. No claims, no accusations, just an evidence chain so clear it didn't need embellishment. The letter ended with a simple statement. We request acknowledgement of a sustained campaign of interference and ask that municipal departments coordinate future inquiries with legal counsel. 2 days later, a marked patrol car passed the house in the early evening. It didn't stop. It didn't slow. But Jessica noticed Karen standing by her mailbox, holding a plastic bag, pretending to sort through its contents while glancing at the car, then at the house. Max, watching through the window, said nothing. He was done speaking about Karen unless necessary. He understood the type. They didn't stop until they were made to, and they rarely walked into their own destruction. They needed help making that happen. Later that same week, a second envelope appeared. This one wasn't anonymous. It was from a local mediation service, inviting Jessica to attend a voluntary neighborhood resolution session regarding disputes related to boundaries, noise, and shared space expectations. Karen's name was listed on the referral form. Jessica nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because the irony was too complete. Karen, who had spent the last month avoiding every direct channel of communication, had now sought a structured environment in which she could present herself as the aggrieved party. Jessica declined the invitation and sent a formal reply through her attorney. All communications concerning neighborhood conflict should now be directed to legal counsel, as an active file was underway. There would be no informal meeting, no emotional arguments across a table moderated by someone untrained in law. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a boundary violation sustained by manipulation and disguised as community concern. That weekend, the trash bins weren't moved. The solar lights remained intact. Even Karen's curtain stayed still. But Jessica didn't mistake quiet for peace. She recognized it for what it was. Retreat. Not surrender. Just a pause. A recalculation. And if Karen thought silence would be enough to undo the momentum now gathering behind the scenes, she was wrong. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about not giving up what was hers. Piece by piece, inch by inch, through 1,000 paper cuts that added up to a single dangerous game. The turning point came not with a crash or a scream, but in the stillness of a late afternoon, when Jessica opened her front door to find a certified letter waiting for her. It had the official seal of the city clerk's office and was marked Final Notice. At first, she assumed it was a continuation of the fabricated complaints Karen had been filing, another desperate attempt to manufacture legal consequence where none existed. But when she opened the envelope and read the contents, her expression darkened. The letter stated that Jessica's property had been flagged for investigation due to suspected unauthorized surveillance installations, citing concerns from local residents about privacy violations and non-disclosed audio monitoring. It wasn't just absurd. It was serious. It meant someone had falsely claimed that the security system installed on her private property was being used to spy on others, an accusation that, if substantiated, could result in legal penalties, forced removal of equipment, and a hearing before the neighborhood board. Jessica set the letter on the kitchen counter, walked upstairs to her home office, and opened the drawer where she kept copies of all receipts and installation documentation. The cameras had been installed by a licensed contractor. The system was wired for motion-only activation. Audio was never enabled. Every detail was in compliance with city code. She had already submitted the specs to her attorney when the previous complaint about lighting interference was filed. But this time, it wasn't about nuisance. It was about making Jessica look like the threat. This wasn't an effort to annoy her. It was an effort to reframe the narrative, to shift the spotlight from Karen's aggression to Jessica's supposed violation. It was a maneuver of desperation, but it was also dangerous. And it confirmed that Karen understood one thing. If she couldn't win through pressure, she would try to win through portrayal. Jessica didn't hesitate. She forwarded the letter to her attorney, who immediately contacted the city's legal department to demand a retraction and an internal review of how the complaint was filed. Within 48 hours, the city clerk's office responded with a formal apology. The complaint had come from a single individual. No supporting evidence had been submitted. The form had been processed automatically due to its urgent classification, but had failed to undergo initial verification. A review had determined that the cameras were entirely legal, properly documented, and posed no privacy risk. The letter of warning was withdrawn and expunged from city record. A copy of the retraction was mailed to Jessica, and an internal notice was issued to the office involved, instructing that all further complaints regarding her property must now pass legal verification before being acted upon. It should have ended there, but it didn't. That same night, Max heard the crunch of footsteps near the back fence. He checked the monitors, saw a figure moving in the blind spot between the garage and the rear hedge. It wasn't Karen. The frame was too slight, the movements too quick. Whoever it was wore a hooded sweatshirt, moved low to the ground, and carried something in their right hand. Max didn't go outside, he didn't need to. The property had been outfitted with thermal motion sensors after the raw meat incident, and the system triggered automatically the moment the intruder stepped into range. A floodlight cut through the darkness, freezing the figure in place just long enough for the high-resolution camera to snap a series of images. The person turned, startled, and bolted, but it was too late. Max had already uploaded the footage to the secure city server, flagged under the ongoing harassment case file. When officers arrived the next morning to review the footage, they were quiet, professional, and notably more invested than before. One of them, a sergeant who'd previously handled noise complaints in the area, recognized the figure from another investigation, an unrelated case involving trespassing and intimidation in a neighboring district. It turned out that the individual in the footage wasn't a resident at all. They were a nephew of Karen's, temporarily living with her between apartments. Someone who had been reported before but never formally charged. Jessica's attorney, upon learning this, submitted a request for an injunction. It wasn't a restraining order, it was a legal perimeter, a formal declaration of spatial violation that required Karen to acknowledge the incident or deny involvement under penalty of perjury. Karen, for the first time, responded not with passive aggression or silence, but with a letter, typed, signed, and oddly polished, denying any connection to the incident. She claimed she was unaware of the person's actions, that she deeply regretted any confusion, and that she hoped a peaceful resolution could be reached through civility and respect. It was too late. The city had the footage, the timing, the overlap of complaints, and a mapped chronology that showed how each event, though seemingly isolated, followed a distinct escalation pattern centered around her property. The narrative Karen had tried to twist was unraveling. The court didn't issue criminal charges. Not yet. But it did approve the injunction, and Karen was formally notified that any future complaint, false statement, or unauthorized activity originating from her household would be treated as coordinated harassment. Her name was entered into a city mediation record, not as a complainant, but as a subject of concern. Jessica didn't celebrate. There were no champagne bottles or smug remarks. She went to the back porch, sat with a mug of coffee, and stared at the camera feed, watching as the fence swayed gently in the wind. Max joined her, but didn't speak. They sat together in silence, not as victors, but as survivors of something most people would never even notice until it was too late. For Karen, the consequences were quiet but devastating. Her reputation among her remaining allies on the block deteriorated rapidly. No one wanted to be associated with someone flagged by the city for sustained, targeted misconduct. She remained in her home, but the curtain no longer twitched. Her porch was suddenly empty, her bird feeder untouched. The woman who had once ruled the sidewalk with whispers and paper forms had become an island, alone in the house she couldn't weaponize anymore. In the weeks that followed, a strange stillness settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't peace in the traditional sense, not the kind marked by reconciliation or understanding. It was more like the stillness that comes after a storm. Quiet, but not quite trusting. Karen remained in her house, but something about her presence had changed. Her routines, the morning walks to the mailbox, the endless hosing of her walkway, the loud phone conversations on the porch, ceased almost entirely. The front yard, once obsessively maintained, began to slip. The flags drooped. The plastic garden statues leaned. Even the laminated no soliciting signs lost their shine and hung at odd angles, curling at the edges. Her windows stayed closed, and the porch lights that used to blaze through the night were dark. Jessica, meanwhile, didn't relax. She wasn't waiting for a final act of defiance or some dramatic retaliation. Instead, she focused on reinforcing what she'd already secured. She finalized her documentation, added extra motion sensors to the eastern fence, and adjusted the front camera to capture a wider radius. The lawyer remained on retainer, not as a threat, but as a form of insurance. She no longer flinched when official-looking envelopes appeared in the mailbox. They were always routine now: utility bills, city updates, the occasional community bulletin. The weight that had hovered just behind every unexpected knock or late-night sound was gone, or at least muted. Max renewed his lease without hesitation. When Jessica asked if he'd ever considered moving, he simply shook his head and said, "I don't run from places I help fix." That quiet loyalty meant more than she could put into words. Their bond wasn't built on shared trauma or dramatic alliance. It was built on something slower, more practical. mutual respect, clarity, the understanding that some neighbors act like predators in disguise, and the only way to deal with them is through structure, not emotion. Jessica's house, once a quiet inheritance, had become something else entirely. A line in the sand, a place where someone finally said no and refused to move back an inch. It wasn't about victory, it was about resilience. And that, in the end, was enough.